What's up, everyone? Today we're going to do some work on my oldest Japanese black pine. This tree came from a private collection here in San Francisco, and it has a very long and sort of interesting history. It was imported from Japan in 1915 for the 1915 Pan Exposition. And that means that it is over 100 years old in this country, which makes it probably one of the older Japanese black pines in the country. I'm sure there's an older one planted in an arboretum somewhere, but as a bonsai, there are very few of them in the United States that are that old. It's kind of a delightful tree, but it has been a bit of a journey for me, having acquired it in, I believe it was 2005. It's now been in my care for 17 or so years. And it took a long time to get it even to the point where you're looking at it right now. And it's going to take even longer to get it to a really good show condition. And it's kind of interesting to think about all the steps that I've gone through. When I bought it, it was in a pot that looked fairly similar to this. But when I asked the former owner when the last time it had been repotted, he said, I think my grandmother repotted it around 1940. And my jaw just kind of dropped. So today I'm going to do what is commonly referred to as decandling, but I'm going to try to convince you that we should actually be calling it summer foliage reduction or summer needle reduction on Japanese black pine. It's really easy to understand in a way what a candle is, but I think that the term candle actually does cause some misunderstanding in that the new growth, this year's growth. So when you're decandling, you're removing all of the current year's growth, and the new growth from this year on this tree is not super long, but it doesn't look like a candle anymore. So it is early June here in San Francisco, just about the time that I start thinking about decandling. In hotter parts of the country, you would decandle slightly later, and you really have to sort of develop your own date as you work with black pines. Some places are too cold to decandle the trees every year. I actually didn't decandle this tree last year because it wasn't super healthy. So this year I'm still not really excited about how much it's growing. It has solid, healthy looking new needles and branch extensions on pretty much every branch, which makes me feel like it is healthy enough to cut back. And I don't want to continue waiting because I don't want it to continue just sort of getting bigger and bigger crown-wise without some control and looking at what I can do with the branches. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to start by decandling the branches. There's going to be some cases where I actually am not going to remove the candles, and those will most likely be the weakest parts of the tree. So down here where these guys are getting a little bit of shade, it might not be productive for me to decandle these because it's just going to cause this little branch potentially to just die off rather than budding back out. If this were a young tree, I wouldn't worry about that quite as much, but with it being 110 plus years old, I start to think about these kinds of things. So down here on the right side of the tree, on the lowest branch, this tree has a very unusual structure, and part of that is just in the history. But I'm going to go ahead and start by removing these candles. This portion is the candle from this year, and then in this case there's also like a little one right there. And in this case I can tell because this year's needles are actually shorter than last year's needles because it wasn't decandled last year. So it's not, there's a slight difference in coloration as well. So as I go through and decandle, I'm going to be removing both the center strong bud and any tiny side buds that are right next to it. If I leave that side bud, then it'll just take off and continue growing. This way, the dormant buds that are right here at the node just behind where I cut will start to grow, and we'll also start to get more back budding and density here in the tree. All right, so that's it, right? So if you go strictly by the term decandling, I'm done decandling. But the problem is that I'm not even close to done. And that's because what we're really doing here is reducing the amount of foliage that the tree has to force the tree to create more foliage on a finer scale, so shorter needles, but also finer branching. If you just let Japanese black pines grow, you're going to get big, long shoots, especially in young trees, and even in older trees that are vigorous. So the next step really here is to thin out a lot of these older needles. And there's two things that I can do. One of them is to just pluck needles entirely, so I can come along and pull off some of the needles. But keep in mind that every time I remove a pair of needles, I'm removing another place where the tree could make more buds. At the center of each one of these is a dormant bud, and given the right stimulus, those buds will start to grow. So instead of just removing sort of needles down to a counted number of pairs, I'm going to start by thinning the top, and I'm going to go in and thin some of this. But I'm going to be doing it judiciously, and I'm going to be leaving needles where I want the tree to have an opportunity to back bud. And then once I've done that, once I'm satisfied that I've removed enough of the needles, if I still need to reduce the density of the needles, I'm going to use a different technique. All right, so now we're getting closer in terms of the density, but I've removed a lot of the needles that I wanted to remove, and what's left are the long needles from last year and some of the older needles. Now, it's not, the tree needs to be less dense than this, in my opinion, in order for it to really have an even back budding effect. And so what I'm going to do next is basically, it's something that I hated when I was a beginner, and that is that I'm going to actually go ahead and cut the needles. The easiest way to do this is to just kind of clump up the needles and just scissor through them all at once. And it has an immediate effect of basically making it look like you decandled last year. And it improves the aesthetic of the plant in the short term. But about a week from now, or maybe a couple of weeks, all of those tips will start to turn brown, and they'll actually kind of turn like a light gray, and it'll look really kind of untidy and not as good as it does if you get naturally short needles. So in this case, I'm not really concerned about what those needles look like, because I'm more concerned what the new needles are going to look like and making sure that the budding is even throughout the tree. So here we go. This is going to have a much more immediate and dramatic effect, I think. As you can see, that makes a pretty big difference in terms of the density and overall look of the tree. And more importantly than that, it allows a lot of light to get in. It allows us to see the structure of the tree really thoroughly. So I could stop here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to look at the structure and see if there's any touch-up that I want to do to the wiring. I wouldn't wait more than about a week to do this step because you could then be potentially knocking off emerging buds. But if we do the decandling and removal of needles and then immediately do the wiring, there's really no downside to it. I wouldn't be doing major branch bending at this time of the year, but it's almost the easiest time to wire, and that's because there are fewer needles than there would be in the fall. Now that I've got all the needles cleaned out, I have gone around and just sort of done some light branch pruning, mostly to try to create a shape in the pads, especially this one. And that just means that I need to remove any shoots that are too long in preparation for wiring. So I'm just trying to have enough foliage here to kind of fill in and make a cohesive pad while eliminating all of the parts that I really don't need. So I've done that here and a little bit up here. And then the next step is going to be I'm going to go in and remove some old wire and add some new wire just to fine tune some of these branches. All right, well, I spared you the wiring time lapse, but put the backdrop down so that you guys can get a better sense of what the tree looks like with a clean background. And it's been it's been a long time that I've been working on this tree, and it's finally sort of got the crown starting to resolve and getting the center of the crown just slightly to the right of the base of the tree. I think gives it better motion, better movement, better harmony of movement, and that makes sort of the top of the tree go with this portion of the tree. Interesting backstory on this was that when I got it, there were no branches over here. This branch is dead, and the only live foliage on the tree was down on this arm. And you can see that there's a piece of rebar right here. This arm was actually out straight, like that direction. And so over the course of a couple of years, I, with the help of my teacher, took a bunch of foliage off of this part and did some grafts back on here. We tried to do a lot of grafts and almost all of them failed. I only got one to take. And this graft is right here. It's now turned into the entire top of the tree. Like I said, it has a really unusual structure, and I think that's one of the things that makes it really interesting. It's not perfect, but it's getting closer to being a mature and refined Japanese black pine again. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of what it looked like when it came into the United States, but that would be a nice thing to look at. See if I could find some pictures from the 1915 Pan Exposition. If you have experience decandling old Japanese black pine, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.